Charles Robert Darwin was born on the 12th of February, 1809, in the market town of Shrewsbury, in the English county of Shropshire, a town of red brick and church spires and the slow bend of the River Severn, set in the rolling farmland of the Welsh borderlands, far enough from London to be provincial and close enough to the new industrial cities of the Midlands to feel the tremors of a world that was beginning to change in ways that nobody had yet learned to describe. He was born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln, a coincidence that strikes some people as meaningful, and that Darwin, who spent his life thinking carefully about the difference between coincidence and cause, would have treated with appropriate skepticism. His father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a physician, a large, prosperous, deeply practical man who had built a successful medical practice in Shrewsbury, and who was, by the time Charles was born, one of the wealthiest doctors in England. Robert Darwin was not a scientist in any formal sense, but he was an acute observer of human nature, possessed of a clinical precision in reading people that his son admired and attempted to inherit. He was also the son of Erasmus Darwin, the physician-poet-naturalist who had written, in the late 18th century, long discursive poems about the natural world that contained, in speculative and poetic form, ideas about the transformation of species that his grandson would spend 20 years converting into evidence. Charles Darwin grew up knowing that his grandfather had thought about these things. He did not know, when he was young, how much of his life would be spent continuing the thought. His mother, Susanna Wedgwood Darwin, was the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood I, the founder of the Wedgwood pottery business. A woman of quiet intelligence and genuine warmth, who died when Charles was 8 years old, of causes that were not clearly documented and that he later said he could barely remember. The loss was real, though his memories of her were few. What he retained, he said, were impressions rather than events. The black velvet gown she wore, the work table she sat at, certain sounds and the quality of certain light. He was raised, after her death, principally by his elder sisters, who were attentive and affectionate, and who managed the large household at the Mount with the competence that the era expected of unmarried women of the middle classes. The house itself, the Mount, a substantial Georgian residence above the river, was the dominant physical environment of his childhood, and its garden was the first laboratory he ever worked in. He collected things. This is the word that comes up in every account of Darwin's childhood, and it is worth pausing on it. He collected beetles, shells, minerals, bird eggs, plants, the accumulated objects of a child who found the natural world inexhaustibly interesting, and who responded to that interest by possessing it, bringing it home, arranging it, cataloging it in the informal way of childhood, before the habits of systematic observation had been formalized. He was not the only Victorian boy who collected natural objects. He was unusual in the seriousness with which he collected them, the attention he paid to differences between specimens, the pleasure he took not just in having but in comparing and classifying. He was also, by his own later account, a mediocre student in the conventional sense. He attended Shrewsbury School, where the curriculum was dominated by classical languages, and where the headmaster, Samuel Butler, grandfather of the novelist, regarded the study of natural history as a waste of time more or less equivalent to the study of nothing. Darwin was not unhappy at school, but he was not stimulated by it. He learned his Latin and his Greek with the minimum of effort consistent with avoiding punishment, spent his free time at his chemistry experiments and his natural history collecting, and received from the educational system the standard judgment that a boy who is not interested in what you are teaching him is probably not very bright. He was not very bright, the system concluded. It was wrong. The town of Shrewsbury itself was a formative environment in ways that go beyond geography. It was a market town with a long history of commerce and civic life, connected to the Welsh borderlands and to the agricultural economy of the Midlands, a place where the natural world was not remote or exotic, but was the daily reality of the surrounding farms and rivers and woodlands. Darwin grew up in a family that was, by the standards of its time and class, unusually attentive to nature. His father maintained a large garden. His uncle Josiah had an estate at Mare that Darwin visited regularly and loved deeply, and the family's Wedgwood connections placed him in a world of educated, scientifically curious people who regarded the investigation of the natural world as a respectable and interesting activity. He absorbed this atmosphere without any particular consciousness that he was absorbing anything. It was simply the air he breathed. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had been, in the decades before Charles was born, a figure of considerable intellectual celebrity, a physician who treated patients across the English Midlands from his home in Lichfield, a poet whose long discursive verses, Zoonomia, the Botanic Garden, the Temple of Nature, combined natural history with speculative philosophy in a way that the 18th century found stimulating, and the 19th century, more rigorous in its requirements for evidence, found embarrassing. Zoonomia, published in 1796, contained passages arguing that all warm-blooded animals might have derived from a single ancestral form over vast periods of time. These passages were speculative, unsupported by systematic evidence, and Erasmus Darwin knew they were speculative. He offered them as ideas rather than conclusions, as starting points for inquiry rather than finished arguments. Charles would later say that his grandfather had anticipated his own ideas, and then would add the qualification that the anticipation was, without the evidence that made the ideas true. Robert Darwin, Charles's father, had little patience for speculation. He was a man of hard-headed practicality, of clinical observation applied to human beings, of money and property, and the management of affairs. He had loved his father while being somewhat embarrassed by Erasmus's more extravagant theoretical flights, and he raised his children with the expectation that they would be solid, practical, and successful in ways that the world recognized. He was not, in any way, opposed to intelligence or to curiosity. He simply wanted those qualities to produce results that could be measured in the conventional currencies of the era: professional success, financial stability, social standing. Charles, who possessed intelligence and curiosity in abundance, and who would eventually produce results that could not be measured in any conventional currency at all, disappointed these expectations in the most spectacular and unlikely way imaginable. The death of Darwin's mother when he was 8 was a loss that shaped the emotional landscape of his childhood in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, partly because Darwin himself was unclear about how much he remembered and how much he had been told. He wrote in his autobiography that his memories of her were almost entirely absent. A few scattered impressions, nothing coherent. He was raised by his elder sisters Caroline, Susan, and Mary Ann, who were affectionate and attentive, and who maintained the large household at the Mount, with the competent, quiet authority of women who understood that this was now their responsibility. He was happy at home, or at least he said so, in the carefully qualified way that people describe childhoods they have thought about carefully enough to know that happiness is not the whole story. His early experiments, the chemistry set in the garden outhouse, the collection of insects and minerals and birds' eggs, were not, in retrospect, merely the hobbies of a precocious child. They were the first expression of a cognitive style that would characterize his entire scientific life. An insistence on the particular, on the individual specimen rather than the general category. on the differences between things that looked alike and the similarities between things that looked different. He collected beetles with a passion that his friends at Cambridge later found amusing, and that he himself described with a combination of amusement and genuine affection, as if looking back at a younger self who already knew what he wanted but did not yet know why he wanted it. He would remember, decades later, specific beetles he had collected at specific locations, the light on specific fields, the names he had not yet learned, and the names he later found. The memory for the particular was a tool of his science. His reading as a child and adolescent was wide and somewhat unguided, the kind of reading that a curious person does when a large library is available and no one is directing their choices. He read travel narratives with particular pleasure, the accounts of voyagers and explorers, the descriptions of landscapes and peoples and natural phenomena that were completely outside the experience of a boy in Shrewsbury. He read and reread Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative of travels to the equinoctial regions of America, the account of Humboldt's journey through Venezuela and Cuba and the Andes in the early years of the 19th century, written in a prose of extraordinary richness and precision that made the tropical world as vivid as if the reader were standing in it. Humboldt became, for Darwin, a model of what a naturalist could be, not merely a collector of specimens but an interpreter of landscapes, a person who could see the relationship between the geology and the climate and the organisms and the human history of a place, and describe that relationship in language that combined scientific precision with literary power. Darwin wanted, from his earliest reading of Humboldt, to do what Humboldt had done. The Beagle gave him the chance. His father sent him to Edinburgh in 1825, at the age of 16, to study medicine. Robert Darwin had decided that Charles would follow him into the profession, and Edinburgh was, at the time, one of the finest medical schools in Europe. A place of serious intellectual life, of good science and good teaching, of the kind of formation that a young man needed to become a competent and prosperous physician. Charles went without objection, partly because he had no clear alternative to offer, and partly because he was genuinely curious about many things, and medicine seemed likely to expose him to many things. He was not suited to it. The surgery disgusted him. The operating theaters of the 1820s were conducted without anesthesia, and the procedures performed on conscious patients produced sounds and sights that Darwin found impossible to watch and impossible to dismiss once watched. He attended 2 operations and refused to attend any more. The lectures were, for the most part, dull. Read from notes by professors who had been reading the same notes for decades, delivered without the enthusiasm that would have made the content bearable. He found, as most people find in the educational institutions that are not quite right for them, that the officially sanctioned curriculum was substantially less interesting than the unofficial alternatives. The unofficial alternatives were considerable. Edinburgh had a vigorous natural history community, and Darwin attached himself to it. To the Plinian Society, a student natural history club that met to discuss specimens and ideas, and to the company of Robert Grant, a zoologist who was conducting research on marine invertebrates, and who introduced Darwin to the actual practice of scientific investigation. The collection of specimens, the use of the microscope, the observation and description of organisms in systematic and careful language. Grant was also, though he was not explicit about this in his conversations with the young Darwin, a follower of Lamarck, a believer in the transformation of species, in the idea that organisms changed over time in response to their environments. Darwin absorbed these conversations, stored them, did not yet know what to do with them. His father, recognizing that the medical career was not going to happen, proposed an alternative: Cambridge and the Church of England. A clergyman's life was, in early Victorian England, a perfectly respectable destination for a gentleman of good family and moderate income, and it had the considerable advantage for someone like Darwin of including a great deal of free time in a country parish, time that could be devoted to natural history without apology. This was not cynical reasoning on Robert Darwin's part, or not entirely. He genuinely believed that Charles could make a useful and contented life as a country parson naturalist, in the tradition that Gilbert White had established at Selborne, and that many of the best amateur naturalists of the century had followed. Darwin accepted the plan, or at least did not reject it, and went to Cambridge in 1828. Cambridge was the making of him, though not in the ways his father had intended. He found the official curriculum, theology, classics, mathematics, only slightly more interesting than Edinburgh's medicine, and he did the minimum necessary to obtain his degree with the same efficient economy of effort he had applied to Shrewsbury's Latin. What he found at Cambridge that changed his life was two people, John Stevens Henslow and Adam Sedgwick. Henslow was the professor of botany, a man of extraordinary warmth and scientific breadth who collected students as generously as he collected plants, inviting them to his Friday evening gatherings, corresponding with them, treating the young men who showed genuine interest in science as colleagues rather than pupils. Darwin became, in the phrase of the Cambridge Common Rooms, the man who walks with Henslow. The phrase was not entirely approving, but it was accurate. Darwin walked with Henslow for hours, on the meadows outside Cambridge, talking about plants and geology and the natural world, and the conversations were, he later said, more educating than anything that happened in lectures. Sedgwick was the professor of geology, a man of fierce energy and absolute conviction who took Darwin on a geological fieldwork excursion through Wales in the summer of 1831, teaching him to read landscapes as records of time, to see in rock formations the accumulated evidence of processes far older than any human history. Darwin absorbed this too, and the absorption was important. The geology that Sedgwick taught him was the conceptual framework within which he would eventually think about evolution, the framework of deep time, of change so slow that individual lives could not perceive it, but that was nonetheless real and vast and consequential. Henslow's letter, at the end of that summer, changed everything else. The Edinburgh period, which lasted from 1825 to 1827, was formative precisely because it was not what it was supposed to be. Darwin arrived expecting to become a physician, and discovered instead that he was not a physician, that the qualities required for medical practice, and particularly for the surgical component of it, were qualities he did not possess or did not want to exercise. He was not unsympathetic to suffering. He was, if anything, too sympathetic. And it was this excess of sympathy that made the operating theater intolerable. He could not be useful under those conditions, and he had the self-knowledge to recognize this and the honesty to act on it, even though acting on it meant disappointing his father. What Edinburgh did give him was his first experience of genuine scientific community, the natural history network he found there. Grant's Laboratory, the Plinian Society, the museum collections that he was permitted to study, was a world in which people argued about real problems on the basis of real evidence, in which the questions were open and the answers were not yet known, and the investigation was the point. He had not encountered this before. School had offered him a curriculum of answers to questions he had not been allowed to ask. Edinburgh offered him questions that nobody had answered yet, and the permission to try to answer them. He was not yet equipped to answer the questions Grant and his colleagues were asking, but he was watching how it was done, and he was beginning to understand what it meant to work. Robert Grant was a complicated figure in the history of biology, a man of genuine scientific ability who held views about the transformation of species that were, in 1825, radically unorthodox, and who had absorbed them partly from Lamarck and partly from Erasmus Darwin's Zoonomia, which he had read carefully. He never explicitly shared these views with the young Darwin in their walks together. He was careful, perhaps, about not burdening a student with ideas that could damage the student's career. But Darwin later said that he could feel them underlying the conversations, could sense the framework within which Grant was placing the questions they discussed. Whether this is retrospective rationalization or genuine memory is impossible to know. What is clear is that Darwin left Edinburgh, having encountered, in the person of Robert Grant, a scientist who took seriously the possibility that species were not fixed, and that this encounter, whatever its specific content, was part of the preparation. Cambridge, when Darwin arrived in 1828, was a very different environment, more comfortable, more socially elaborate, more oriented toward the formation of English gentlemen than toward the advancement of science. The college life, the dinners and the card games and the sporting occasions and the long hours of socializing that the college system both required and encouraged, was something Darwin participated in with genuine pleasure, though he later expressed some guilt about the time it consumed. He was not a scholar in the conventional Cambridge sense. He was not a mathematician, and Cambridge in 1828 rewarded mathematics above everything else. He was a naturalist, and the Cambridge of Henslow and Sedgwick rewarded naturalists in the unofficial ways that universities have always rewarded the people who do not quite fit the official mold. The botanical excursions with Henslow were, in the deepest sense, a tutorial in attention. Henslow moved through a landscape as someone who saw it completely. The soil, the plants, the insects on the plants, the relationships between them, the geological formation that the plants were growing on, the agricultural history that had shaped the field edge, the names in Latin and English, the distribution in Britain and Europe, the variations between individuals of the same species. He showed Darwin how to look, which is a different thing from being told what to see. Darwin already knew how to observe. What Henslow taught him was how to observe systematically, how to place an observation in a framework, how to ask the next question after you had answered the first. This was not a lesson that could be taught in lectures. It was a lesson that required someone to walk beside you while you did it. The friendship with Henslow was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential relationships in the history of science. Not because Henslow was himself a scientist of the first rank, but because he recognized Darwin's qualities at a moment when nobody else had, and gave them the support and the direction they needed. He wrote to Darwin throughout the voyage, sent him books, received his letters with their packed observations, and helped him understand what he was seeing by placing it in the context of the broader natural history literature. He presented Darwin's geological letters to the Cambridge Philosophical Society during the voyage, establishing a preliminary scientific reputation that would allow Darwin's return to be received as the return of a serious scientist, rather than merely an interesting amateur. The patronage was informal but real, and it shaped everything that followed. The geological excursion in Wales with Sedgwick in the summer of 1831 was Darwin's first experience of fieldwork in the strict scientific sense. Not the collecting of specimens, but the systematic investigation of a landscape for evidence of its history. Sedgwick was teaching him to read rock as a text, to see in the angle of a stratum and the character of a fossil and the color of a cliff face the record of processes that had operated over spans of time that no human imagination was quite equipped to hold. Darwin was a quick learner, and he was also a physically robust and willing field companion. He walked long distances without complaint, scrambled up slopes that gave his companions difficulty, and arrived at each outcrop with the fresh attention that Sedgwick valued in a student. He returned from Wales with a notebook full of geological observations and the framework of geological thinking installed in his mind in a way that lectures could not have installed it. 2 months later, Henslow's letter arrived. The letter from Henslow arrived in August 1831. It said that a naval survey vessel, HMS Beagle, was being prepared for a voyage to chart the coasts of South America and to take a series of chronometric measurements around the world to improve the accuracy of global navigation charts. The captain of the vessel, Robert Fitzroy, was a young man of 26, a gentleman and an officer, who wanted a companion for the voyage. Specifically, a gentleman companion, someone of his own social class who could talk with him at dinner and travel with him on shore expeditions and provide the kind of society that the naval hierarchy made impossible on board ship, where a captain could not socially associate with his officers. Fitzroy also wanted a naturalist, someone who could collect specimens and make observations during the voyage's many shore visits. Henslow had been asked to recommend someone. He recommended Darwin. The negotiations that followed were more complicated than the simplicity of the eventual outcome suggests. Robert Darwin was opposed. Opposed on the grounds that the voyage would disrupt Charles's career trajectory, that the ship was unsafe, that the plan was harebrained, that Charles had already changed his plans twice, and that this represented another change. He listed his objections in detail and told Charles that if he could find a single man of sense who recommended the plan, he would withdraw his opposition. Charles rode to Mere, the Wedgwood estate in Staffordshire, to spend the night and consult his uncle Josiah Wedgwood too. Josiah Wedgwood read the list of objections and addressed each one in writing, calmly and systematically, and concluded that the voyage was an excellent opportunity for a young man of scientific bent. Robert Darwin, who respected Josiah Wedgwood's judgment, withdrew his opposition. Charles wrote to accept. The Beagle sailed from Plymouth on the 27th of December, 1831. Darwin was 22 years old. He did not know, as the ship moved out of Plymouth Sound into the gray December waters of the English Channel, that he would not see England again for nearly 5 years. He was immediately, catastrophically seasick. Seasick in the comprehensive way of a person who has discovered that their body and the motion of ships are fundamentally incompatible, confined to his hammock, unable to eat, barely able to read, producing in the journals he kept from the very beginning of the voyage entries that combined precise scientific observation with frank admissions of physical misery. He was seasick, on and off, for most of the 5 years. He went around the world seasick. He also went around the world transformed. The Beagle's route took her across the Atlantic to Brazil, down the coast of South America to Tierra del Fuego, up the Chilean and Peruvian coasts, across the Pacific to the Galapagos Islands, then to Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, and home via the Indian Ocean and South Africa. At each stop, Darwin went ashore, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, while the Beagle continued its survey work offshore and collected. He collected with the systematic passion of someone who has understood somewhere in the previous 2 years that collecting is not mere accumulation, but a form of argument. That the specimens brought back, compared and contrasted, and placed in their relationships to each other and to the environments that produced them, had things to say about the world that no amount of theorizing from the armchair could replicate. The landscapes he encountered were the landscapes of a man discovering, for the first time, the scale and variety of the living world. The tropical forest of Brazil, the pampas of Argentina, the Andes, the desert of Atacama, the volcanic islands of the Pacific. Each environment was, to Darwin's prepared and attentive eye, a set of questions that he was not yet equipped to answer, but that he was accumulating the evidence to address. He dug fossils out of the cliffs at Punta Alta, enormous bones of extinct creatures, Megatherium and Toxodon and Mylodon, the bones of animals that had lived in South America and were now gone, animals that resembled in general form the living animals of the same continent, while being different from them in specific details. He noticed this. He did not yet know what to make of it. The Galapagos Islands, which he visited in September and October of 1835, have been so thoroughly mythologized in the story of Darwin's discovery of natural selection that it is important to state, as carefully as possible, what actually happened there and what did not. What happened? He collected birds, lizards, tortoises, and plants, and he noted that the creatures of the islands differed from those of the South American mainland, and, less clearly noted at the time, that the creatures of different islands within the archipelago differed from each other. What did not happen? The immediate revelation, the scales falling from the eyes, the on-the-spot formulation of the theory of natural selection. That theory was not formulated in the Galapagos. It was formulated in London in 1838, after 2 years of reading and thinking and correspondence, and the Galapagos specimens were one piece of evidence among many that pointed toward it. The myth of the Galapagos as the site of instantaneous illumination is a good story. It is not accurate. The 5 years of the Beagle voyage were, in retrospect, the necessary education that no university could have provided. Darwin had been a capable naturalist before he sailed. He returned as something qualitatively different. A person who had seen the variety of the natural world in its full extent, who had placed his observations in the framework of geological time that Lyell's Principles of Geology, which he read on the voyage, in the copies that Henslow had pressed on him at departure, provided, and who had been confronted repeatedly and inescapably with patterns in the distribution and morphology of organisms that the existing explanations could not account for. The most important intellectual tool he had for the voyage, apart from Henslow's training, was Lyell's uniformitarianism, the geological principle that the Earth had been shaped by the same processes: erosion, deposition, volcanic activity, uplift, that were observable in the present day, operating over vast spans of time, rather than by the catastrophic events that the previous generation of geologists had invoked to explain the geological record. Uniformitarianism was, in the hands of its greatest advocate, a way of thinking about time that had no precedent in the religious or the philosophical traditions Darwin had grown up in. It said that the Earth was incomprehensibly old, and that what looked like sudden change was actually gradual process observed at a moment of compression. Darwin read Lyell on the Beagle and understood, perhaps for the first time, what deep time really meant. The understanding would prove essential. His geological observations during the voyage were, in the judgment of geologists who have revisited them, of the first quality. His account of the formation of coral reefs, published in 1842 as The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs, the first major scientific work he published after the voyage, proposed a theory of atoll formation that was confirmed by drilling evidence a century later. His geological observations in South America, in the Andes along the Chilean coast, were careful and systematic, and they contributed to the understanding of the tectonic processes that were reshaping the continent. He was, in these years, a geologist as much as a zoologist, and the geological habits of mind, the reading of landscapes as records of process, the inference of past conditions from present evidence, were habits that he carried into his zoological and biological work. Captain Fitzroy was, throughout the voyage, a fascinating and sometimes difficult companion. He was a brilliant navigator, a meticulous scientist in his own right, and a person of deep religious conviction who would eventually, after the publication of The Origin, publicly repent his role in bringing Darwin to a position where he could develop his theory. On the voyage, he and Darwin were genuinely friends, reading and arguing and sharing the close quarters of a small ship with the occasional tensions that long confinement produces, but also with the mutual respect of two intelligent people recognizing each other's qualities. Fitzroy's religious conservatism and Darwin's developing skepticism were already present in embryonic form during the voyage. They disagreed occasionally about the implications of what they observed, but the disagreement did not damage the friendship until much later, and in many ways the tension between them was productive for Darwin, forcing him to articulate his observations clearly enough to defend them. The journal Darwin kept throughout the voyage, revised and published as The Voyage of the Beagle, is remarkable for the quality of its observation and for the quality of its prose. He was 22 when the voyage began, and 27 when it ended, and the writing of a 22-year-old has a freshness and an immediacy that the writing of a more experienced author sometimes loses. He was describing things he had never seen before, in a state of genuine wonder that he did not attempt to conceal. The tropical forest, the pampas, the mountains, the Pacific light. He was also thinking, in the interstices of the description, about what the things he saw meant, and the thinking is visible in the text. The slight pauses, the qualifications, the questions that are noted but not yet answered. The specimens Darwin collected during the voyage arrived in England in batches, sent back from ports along the route, and they were received and cared for during his absence by Henslow, who unpacked them, preserved what needed preserving, catalogued what could be catalogued, and waited for the collector's return before attempting any systematic interpretation. The total of what Darwin brought back was enormous by the standards of the era. 529 species preserved in spirits, 907 labeled skins, bones, and miscellaneous specimens. He had also made geological collections at nearly every stop, and he had filled notebooks with observations and sketches that were, in their own right, a significant scientific record. The distribution of species across the South American continent had been one of the most persistent puzzles Darwin had confronted during the voyage. Why were the animals of South America distinctively South American, related to each other, sharing a general character that distinguished them from the animals of Africa or of Australia, if they had been separately created for each geographical region? The conventional answer, that God had created the appropriate animals for each environment, could account for the gross distribution, but not for the fine structure. The way that closely related species replaced each other as you moved from north to south along the continent, the way that the animals of the Galapagos resembled the animals of South America but were subtly different, the way that the species of the different Galapagos Islands resembled each other more closely than they resembled anything from the mainland. These patterns had no explanation within the framework of separate creation. They had a natural explanation within the framework of common descent. The mockingbirds of the Galapagos were, in the end, more important to the development of Darwin's theory than the finches that have become the iconic image of his time there. Darwin noticed, during the voyage, that the mockingbirds of different islands were distinct, that the birds of Charles Island differed from those of Albemarle Island, and both differed from those of James Island. He noted this observation in his journal with a precision that suggests he already half understood its significance. The finches he did not fully attend to at the time. It was the ornithologist John Gould who examined the specimens after Darwin's return, who identified them as a remarkable group of related species, and who pointed out the relationship between beak form and food source that has become the textbook illustration of adaptive radiation. Darwin incorporated Gould's observations into his thinking, and the finches became part of the Galapagos story, though a part that was reconstructed retrospectively rather than observed directly. Darwin returned to England on the 2nd of October 1836, a person substantially different from the one who had left 5 years before. He had been seasick, and exhilarated, and frightened, and bored, and overwhelmed, and lonely, and happier than he had ever been, sometimes in the space of a single day. He had seen landscapes that no natural history book had prepared him for. He had collected thousands of specimens, geological, zoological, botanical, and shipped them back to England in crates that had arrived, mostly in good order. He had filled notebooks with observations and sketches and questions. He had become, in the years of the voyage, a naturalist of real authority, a person who knew the natural world from direct experience of its variety, and who had the specimens to show for it. He had also, without being fully conscious of it, become a person who was being quietly unsettled by what he had seen. The fossils at Punta Alta troubled him. The relationship between the animals of the Galapagos and those of South America troubled him. The pattern of replacement, the way one species seemed to grade into another as you move through a landscape, the way the fauna of different continents was distinct in ways that did not easily map onto the conventional explanation of separate divine creation, troubled him in the specific way that things trouble a rigorous mind, as gaps between the observed evidence and the available explanation that the available explanation could not close. He settled in London, gave the specimens to specialists for identification and description, began writing what would become the Journal of Researches, the narrative account of the voyage, published in 1839, and known to subsequent generations as The Voyage of the Beagle, one of the finest scientific travel books ever written. He also began, in July 1837, the first of the private notebooks that he called his Transmutation Notebooks, the records of his thinking about the origin and transformation of species that he maintained in strict privacy for the next 20 years. The notebooks are extraordinary documents, the record of a first-rate mind working through a problem of enormous complexity, following threads, abandoning them, picking them up again, reading voraciously across botany and zoology and geology and animal breeding and economics and theology and anything else that seemed relevant, building an argument that he could feel taking shape before he could articulate its structure. He read Thomas Malthus in September 1838, the essay on the principle of population, with its argument that populations always tend to increase faster than their food supply, producing a constant pressure of competition for limited resources, a struggle in which many individuals must die so that some can survive. Darwin read this and something clicked. He wrote in his notebook after reading Malthus, "It at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. The theory was natural selection, the idea that the variation present in every population, combined with the struggle for existence that Malthus had described, would produce a differential survival. The individuals whose variations gave them an advantage in the struggle would tend to leave more offspring, and those offspring would inherit the advantageous variation, and over generations the population would change in the direction of the advantage, until it had changed enough to constitute something that we would recognize as a different species. The mechanism was simple. The implications were immense. He did not publish. He kept working. The reasons for not publishing were complex and have been much discussed by historians of science. There was the incompleteness of the evidence. The theory was clear in outline, but the detailed case, the demonstration from natural history and paleontology and geology and animal breeding and geographical distribution, that the theory was not merely possible but actually the correct account of how species had originated, required the accumulation of far more evidence than Darwin had in 1838. There was also, undeniably, the awareness that what he was proposing would be understood as an attack on the natural theology that underpinned the religious beliefs of most of his contemporaries, including his wife, Emma, whom he married in January 1839, and whose response to the manuscript he eventually showed her. She found it troubling and said so, gently, in a letter that he kept for the rest of his life, confirmed what he had feared. The London years, from 1836 to 1842, were the years in which Darwin transformed from a brilliant young naturalist with interesting observations into a theoretical biologist of the first rank. The transformation required not just the accumulation of ideas, though there was accumulation in great quantities, but the development of a new way of thinking about organisms, a way that placed individual variation and the mechanism of inheritance at the center of the picture rather than at its periphery. His reading during this period was extraordinary in its range. He read not only the natural history and geology that were his professional concerns, but economics, philosophy, history, travel literature, novels, poetry. He read Malthus. He read the political economists who had developed Malthus's ideas. He read breeders, manuals, and agricultural journals, seeking the practical wisdom of the people who had been deliberately modifying organisms through selection for generations. He attended shows of domesticated animals, cattle and dogs and pigeons, and talked to the breeders, asking the same questions that a farmer might ask about what could be changed and how quickly, and what the limits were. The breeders knew things that the naturalists did not know, because the breeders had been running the experiment that nature ran blindly, running it with a purpose, and recording the results. Darwin absorbed their practical knowledge with the same attention he gave to the most abstruse theoretical text. The transmutation notebooks that he began in July 1837 and maintained through the following years are among the most intimate scientific documents in the history of biology. They are working documents, records of a mind in process, with all the dead ends and reversals and sudden connections that a mind in process produces. He argues with himself. He notes objections and then attempts to answer them. He formulates hypotheses and immediately begins looking for evidence that would disprove them, because he understands that a hypothesis that cannot be disproved is not a hypothesis but a belief. He is, in these notebooks, doing the specific intellectual work of science, the work of subjecting ideas to the test of evidence and abandoning the ideas that fail. The reading of Malthus in September 1838 was not the creation of the theory of natural selection from nothing. It was the provision of a mechanism for a transformation that Darwin had already concluded must have occurred. He already knew that species changed over time. The fossil record, the geographical distribution of species, the patterns he had observed on the Beagle, all pointed to this. What he had not yet had was a mechanism, a process operating in nature that could explain how the change occurred, that was consistent with the observed facts, and that did not require the invocation of guidance or intention. Natural selection, as the reading of Malthus clarified it for him, was that mechanism. The population pressure that Malthus described produced the competition. The variation present in every population, variation that the breeders exploited deliberately, meant that some individuals were better equipped for the competition than others. Those better equipped individuals would, on average, survive and reproduce more successfully. Their offspring would inherit their advantages. Over generations, the population would change. Over very many generations, it would change enough to constitute a different species. The years of secrecy after 1838, the 20 years during which Darwin knew the theory and did not publish it, have been the subject of considerable historical analysis, with interpretations ranging from cowardice to strategic patience to the genuine scientific scruple of a man who would not publish until the evidence was complete. The most accurate account probably combines elements of all three. Darwin was afraid of the social consequences of the theory, particularly for Emma and for the social world they inhabited. He was also, genuinely and without self-deception, aware that the evidence was incomplete, and that the incompleteness was not merely a matter of additional supporting details, but of fundamental gaps in the argument. And he was, perhaps most importantly, a scientific perfectionist who could not bear to present an argument that was not as strong as he could make it. The 1844 essay, a 230-page sketch of the full theory that Darwin wrote and showed to Hooker but did not publish, was accompanied by a letter to Emma asking her to publish it in the event of his death, with specific instructions about who should edit it and how it should be presented. He was 35 years old. The instruction was not melodramatic. It was practical. He was often seriously ill, and he knew that if he died without having published, the work would be lost, or would wait for decades, while someone else caught up with what he had already worked out. The letter to Emma, and the sealed essay to which it referred, were the acknowledgment that the theory existed, and that it was real, and that it mattered, even when the author was not ready to tell the world. The specific nature of Darwin's illness remains a genuine medical puzzle. He suffered from nausea and vomiting, from heart palpitations, from extreme fatigue, from skin complaints, from recurring headaches, from what he described as a swimming in the head. He had been well before the Beagle voyage, and unwell intermittently but persistently after it. Various diagnoses have been proposed by later medical historians. Chagas disease, contracted from the bite of a South American insect during the voyage. Psychosomatic illness generated by the anxiety of knowing what he knew and not yet being able to say it. A combination of factors that included both genuine organic pathology and the psychosomatic amplification of real symptoms by a nervous constitution. The question has not been resolved, and may not be resolvable. What is clear is that the illness was real, that it limited his working hours and his social capacity throughout his adult life, and that he worked around it with a resourcefulness that produced, in the limited hours available, one of the largest and most consequential scientific outputs of the century. Darwin and Emma moved to Down House in the village of Down in the North Downs of Kent in September 1842. The house was large and comfortable and somewhat isolated. A 2-hour carriage ride from London, set at the end of a quiet lane in rolling farmland, surrounded by a garden that Darwin immediately began to modify for experimental purposes, and by a countryside that provided the long, slow walks he needed for thinking. He had chosen it deliberately, with the knowledge that he was choosing a kind of withdrawal from London, from the scientific society that he found stimulating but exhausting, from the constant social demands of a life lived in the city. He would correspond with everyone, he would visit occasionally, he would live it down. He lived there for the remaining 40 years of his life. It was an extraordinary commitment to a single place, and it was also in part a consequence of the illness that had begun during the voyage and that became, in the years after his return, a persistent feature of his existence. He was sick. He was sick in ways that defeated diagnosis at the time and have not been definitively diagnosed since. He suffered from nausea, from heart palpitations, from extreme fatigue, from a sensitivity to social stimulation that could leave him prostrate for days after a dinner party. The illness was real. The symptoms were documented by his doctors and by himself in careful detail, and it was also, in a way that he seems to have partially understood, convenient. It excused him from engagements he did not want to attend. It gave him a reason to stay it down, to limit his correspondence to the written rather than the personal, to structure his days around the work rather than around the social obligations that the work's eventual fame would have made overwhelming. His days at Down were structured with a regularity that the illness required and that his temperament had always preferred. He rose at 7, took a short walk, breakfasted, and worked in his study from 8 until 10:30 or 11. He then took a longer walk. Around the sandwalk, the path he had created in a piece of woodland at the edge of the property, which he walked daily in circuits that he counted with a pile of flints at the corner, one flint kicked aside for each circuit until he had done the number he had decided on. He called the sandwalk his thinking path, and it was. The rhythmic movement of walking, in familiar surroundings, without the demands of conversation or correspondence, was the condition in which his thinking developed and clarified. He solved problems on the sandwalk that his study had left intractable. After the walk, he would answer correspondence in the study until lunch, rest after lunch, walk again in the afternoon, and read in the evening. Emma read aloud to him after dinner. Novels, history, poetry, whatever they were working through together. They had 10 children, of whom 7 survived to adulthood. The house was full of children and experiment. Darwin used his children as experimental subjects in the mild and entirely benign sense of observing them, with the same attention he gave to barnacles and earthworms, noting the development of their emotional expressions, their first words, their responses to various stimuli, and recording these observations in the notebooks that he kept for every subject that interested him. The children appear to have found this entirely normal. Several of them became distinguished scientists. The work at Down in the 1840s and 1850s was not the work of a man who was secretly writing a book about evolution, though the secret book was being written. It was also the work of a man pursuing a series of detailed, rigorous, publicly available investigations in natural history that were building his scientific reputation and, more importantly to him, his understanding. He spent 8 years studying barnacles, the small crustaceans that encrust rocks and ship hulls, and the shells of other creatures, in a project that produced 2 substantial monographs and that gave him a knowledge of species variation in a specific group of organisms so thorough that he could argue, from the barnacle evidence alone, that the boundaries between species were not fixed and absolute, but gradual and contingent. He also, throughout this period, conducted experiments in his garden on the fertilization of flowers, on the dispersal of seeds, on the behavior of climbing plants, experiments that were published in their own right, and that were also simultaneously gathering the evidence that his larger argument would need. The choice of Down House as a permanent residence was also a choice about the kind of scientist Darwin would be. He was, by 1842, known in the scientific community, but not yet famous, and the trajectory of his career would have looked, to an outside observer, like the trajectory of a man heading toward the kind of established scientific position that the Victorian era offered its most distinguished naturalists. A professorship, perhaps, or a curatorship at the Natural History Museum, a fellowship of the Royal Society, and the civic obligations that went with it. Darwin chose none of these. He chose instead the life of the independent gentleman scientist, a life made possible by his comfortable inherited income and his marriage into the Wedgwood family, who had money enough to supplement it. A life in which he owed no institutional obligations, had no teaching requirements, and could direct every working hour toward the questions he found most interesting. This was, in terms of what it produced, the right choice. The freedom to work slowly and deeply on a single large problem, to conduct experiments that took years to yield results, to read widely and without immediate practical purpose. These conditions were exactly what the development of the theory of natural selection required. An academic post would have fragmented his time and his attention. Downehouse concentrated them. He understood this at some level even in 1842, before the theory was fully formed. He was choosing the life that would let him do the work, without yet knowing precisely what form the work would take. Emma Darwin is an underappreciated figure in the history of science, because the contribution she made was not the kind that histories of science typically record. She was not a scientist. She was a musician, a reader, a devoted mother to a large family, and a person of deep Christian faith who managed, throughout her long marriage, to a man whose work seemed to undermine the foundations of her faith, to maintain both her love for him and her own beliefs, without forcing a resolution that neither of them wanted. She had written to him in 1838 before their marriage, a letter in which she said that she hoped he would not put anything out of his power to believe, that she would be most unhappy if she thought they did not belong to each other forever. He kept this letter all his life, writing at the bottom of it, "When I am dead, know that many times I have kissed and cried over this." Their domestic life at Down was, by every account, genuinely happy. A remarkable thing, given the chronic illness, the large family, the professional pressure, and the awareness that the work being done in the study was going to disturb many of the certainties that made their world legible. They were well matched. His intensity and abstractedness with her practicality and warmth, his tendency to go too far into the detail of a problem with her capacity to stand back and ask whether the problem was the right one, his isolation with her sociability. She entertained the visitors he could not face. She managed the correspondence when he was too ill to sit at his desk. She read to him every evening from the novels that provided, in the years of the most intense intellectual labor, the relief of other people's stories. On the 18th of June, 1858, Darwin received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a naturalist working in the Malay archipelago, a man who had spent years collecting specimens in the Amazon and the islands of Southeast Asia, and who had been thinking, from the evidence he had accumulated, about the same problem that Darwin had been thinking about for 20 years. The letter contained a short essay in which Wallace outlined a theory of species transformation through natural selection that was, in all its essential features, the same as the theory Darwin had developed and not yet published. Darwin's response, in the letter he wrote immediately to his friend and geological mentor Charles Lyell, was a model of a certain kind of controlled anguish. He had been forestalled, all the years of work might count for nothing, the priority that he had earned by 20 years of accumulation was about to be lost. He told Lyell that he would rather burn his whole book than that he or any other man should think he had behaved in a paltry spirit. He meant it. He was also, understandably, devastated. Lyell and Joseph Hooker, Darwin's closest scientific friends and the two men most familiar with his unpublished theory, arranged a solution of uncommon elegance. They presented at a meeting of the Linnean Society on the 1st of July, 1858, a paper that included extracts from Darwin's notebooks written in 1844 and a letter he had written to the American botanist Asa Gray in 1857, alongside Wallace's essay. The evidence of Darwin's priority was thus established. Wallace received the credit for independent simultaneous discovery. Neither man was diminished. The arrangement was made without consulting Wallace, who was in the field and could not be reached in time, and who received the news of it with a generosity that says a great deal about his character. Darwin spent the following 13 months writing. He had intended at the time of Wallace's letter to produce a multi-volume work of exhaustive documentation, the full case for natural selection, with every piece of evidence laid out in detail. He abandoned this plan in favor of what he called an abstract, a single volume, tightly argued, presenting the core of the theory with enough evidence to make the case and enough clarity to make the argument accessible to the general educated reader as well as the specialist. He wrote at a pace he described as extraordinary. His usual pace was a paragraph a day, carefully revised. In these 13 months, he produced 3 or 4 pages a day, revised later. He was 50 years old, and he was, finally, writing the book. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, was published by John Murray on the 24th of November, 1859. The first edition of 250 copies sold out on the first day. A second edition was ordered immediately. The book was readable, genuinely readable, in the way that very few scientific works of comparable importance are readable. Written in a prose of careful precision and occasional beauty, building its argument from accumulated evidence with the patience of a man who had spent 20 years learning how to make exactly this case. The argument was the theory of natural selection, supported by evidence from animal breeding, from the geographical distribution of species, from the fossil record, from comparative anatomy, from embryology, from the behavior of instincts. The conclusion was that all living organisms on Earth had descended, with modification, from common ancestors, through the mechanism of natural selection acting on heritable variation. The reaction was immediate, various, and enormous. Scientists discussed it. Theologians denounced it. Popular opinion divided along lines that roughly tracked the question of whether you were more alarmed by the implications for human origins, or more excited by the explanatory power of the theory. The famous confrontation at the Oxford meeting of the British Association in June 1860 between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley, who had read the book and declared himself a convert, ready to fight Darwin's battles while Darwin stayed it down, became the iconic scene of the public debate, though like most iconic scenes, it was considerably more complicated in reality than in retrospect. Darwin was not at Oxford. He was at a hydropathic establishment in Yorkshire, trying to recover from the exhaustion of finishing the book. He read the accounts of the debate at second hand. He was glad Huxley had been there. The publication of The Origin in November 1859 was received with a velocity and a breadth of attention that the publishing history of scientific works had not previously recorded. Within weeks it was being reviewed in every major journal in Britain, discussed in the churches and the common rooms and the drawing rooms of educated England, translated for publication in German and French and Dutch. The speed of the reception reflected something real. People understood immediately and without difficulty that this was a book that mattered, that the question it was addressing, the question of where the living world had come from, and how it had come to be arranged as it was a question of the deepest significance, and that the answer it was providing was not a comfortable one. Darwin's position during the debate that followed was strategic and consciously maintained. He stayed it down. He wrote letters. He sent long, careful responses to scientific reviewers. He provided information, specimens, references to other workers in the field, answers to specific objections. He did not appear in public. He did not attend the meetings where his book was discussed. He was genuinely ill, often. The exertion of finishing the book had left him depleted in ways that were real and not merely convenient, but the pattern of strategic withdrawal was also deliberate. He had learned over the years of keeping his theory private that his temperament was not suited to public controversy, that he became too anxious and too personally invested in the arguments, and that the case for natural selection would be better made by advocates who were more combative than he was. Huxley was the perfect advocate, combative, eloquent, willing to fight, intellectually rigorous and rhetorically skilled in approximately equal measure. Hooker was the botanist whose detailed knowledge of plant distribution gave the case for evolution-specific and technical support. Asa Gray in America was the botanist who carried the argument across the Atlantic. Charles Lyell, whose geological uniformitarianism had provided the conceptual framework of deep time within which evolution could occur, took longer to be persuaded, and his partial endorsement of the theory in his Antiquity of Man in 1863 was, from Darwin's point of view, both welcome and frustrating. Welcome because Lyell's prestige was enormous, frustrating because Lyell had not committed himself fully. Darwin never fully forgave Lyell his caution, which is perhaps uncharitable given that Lyell was 65 years old when The Origin was published, and was being asked to change a framework he had spent 40 years building. The reception in Germany was early and enthusiastic, shaped principally by Ernst Haeckel, a zoologist of great energy and somewhat variable rigor, who became the leading German Darwinian, and who, in the process, extended and modified Darwin's theory in directions that Darwin sometimes found difficult to endorse. Haeckel's recapitulation theory, the idea that the embryonic development of an organism replays the evolutionary history of its ancestors, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, was an elaboration of Darwinian principles that was later found to be substantially wrong in its details, though it pointed toward genuine relationships between development and evolution that are still being investigated. Darwin's relationship with Haeckel was warm but cautious. He was grateful for the advocacy and uncertain about some of the claims. The specific objections to the theory of natural selection that Darwin faced in the years after 1859 were of two main kinds: scientific objections, which argued that the mechanism was insufficient or that the evidence was inadequate, and religious objections, which argued that the theory was incompatible with Christian belief and with the dignity of the human species. Darwin addressed the scientific objections carefully, in successive editions of The Origin, and in the supplementary works that followed it. He found the religious objections more difficult to address, partly because they were not always stated in terms that admitted of a scientific answer, and partly because he genuinely did not want to hurt people whose faith was important to them and whose hurt he could foresee. The most serious scientific objection came from the physicist Fleming Jenkin, who argued in 1867 that natural selection could not work in the way Darwin described because any advantageous variation in an individual would be diluted by half in each generation, as the individual bred with unmodified partners, and would be diluted to negligibility within a few generations. This was a correct application of the blending theory of inheritance, the theory that inherited characteristics were blended in offspring, like the mixing of fluids. That was the prevailing theory of the day. Darwin had no answer to it, because the answer required Mendel's genetics, and Mendel's work, published in 1866, was not known to Darwin or to the broader scientific community until 1900. The problem of inheritance was the largest unresolved problem in the origin, and Darwin knew it, and he never resolved it. The resolution came 18 years after his death, in a form that made natural selection more powerful, not less. Darwin's response to this objection was, characteristically, to go back to the evidence. He increased his emphasis on the accumulation of individual small variations over long periods, on the slowness of the process, on the great age of the Earth. He was not wrong. Natural selection does work in the way he described, but his defense was incomplete because the mechanism of inheritance that would have completed it was not yet available to him. He died not knowing that Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk working with pea plants in a monastery garden in Brno, had already discovered the particulate inheritance that resolved the problem. The irony is precise and somewhat melancholy. The two great discoveries of 19th-century biology, Darwin's natural selection and Mendel's genetics, were made within 5 years of each other, in complete ignorance of each other, by two men who would together have provided a complete theory of evolution decades before the modern synthesis that finally united them in the 1940s. The Origin of Species did not discuss human origins. The omission was deliberate and strategic. Darwin included a single sentence near the book's end, suggesting that the theory would eventually illuminate the origin of human beings and their history, and left the rest to the reader's inference. The inference was not difficult to draw. Every reader of The Origin understood that if all species had descended with modification from common ancestors, then human beings were included in this history, that humanity was not separate from nature, but continuous with it, not the special creation of a divine hand, but the product of the same processes that had produced every other organism on Earth. Darwin waited 12 years to address this directly. The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, published in 1871, made explicit what The Origin had left implicit, that human beings had descended from ape-like ancestors, that the mental and moral faculties of human beings had evolved by the same processes as their physical attributes, that the difference between humanity and the rest of the animal kingdom was one of degree rather than kind. The book also introduced, at length, the concept of sexual selection, the process by which mate choice shapes the evolution of characteristics that are not directly useful for survival, but that increase reproductive success, and applied it both to animals and to human beings. The Descent of Man is not as unified a book as The Origin. It is two books, essentially. A long argument about human evolution and the continuity of human mental and moral faculties with those of other animals, and a very long argument about sexual selection that occupies most of its second volume. The two parts were planned as separate books and combined partly for commercial reasons. The argument about human evolution is, in its essential features, correct. The fossil record and the genetic evidence accumulated since 1871 have confirmed, in detail far beyond what Darwin could have imagined, that human beings share common ancestors with other primates, and that the distinctive features of human cognition are extensions and elaborations of capacities present in other animals. The decade of the 1860s, between The Origin and The Descent, was not a decade of rest. Darwin published the various contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects in 1862. a book-length study of the relationship between flowers and their pollinators that demonstrated, in meticulous detail, the way that natural selection had shaped the elaborate and beautiful structures of orchid flowers for the specific purpose of attracting and using insects to carry pollen. He published The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication in 1868, a massive 2-volume work presenting the evidence for heritable variation in domestic breeds. He published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals in 1872, a study of emotional expression that was, among other things, a contribution to the new science of psychology, arguing that the expressions of emotion in human faces were continuous with and evolved from the expressions of emotion in other animals. The sheer volume of Darwin's published output across these years is astonishing, and it becomes more astonishing when you consider that he produced it in the intervals of chronic illness, of large family, of the extensive correspondence that made him the center of an international scientific community. He received letters from naturalists, botanists, zoologists, farmers, breeders, missionaries, and curious members of the public from every corner of the world, and he answered them, all of them, or nearly all, with the patience and the precision that had always characterized his scientific work. He asked questions of everyone who might have evidence relevant to his theories. Could the missionary in New Guinea observe whether the local population showed the same emotional expressions as Europeans? Could the farmer in New South Wales tell him about the rate of survival of different breeds in drought conditions? The replies came back, and Darwin incorporated them into the great accumulation of evidence that his published work represented. His relationship with his wife Emma during these years was the quiet, sustaining center of a life that was, in its public dimensions, anything but quiet. Emma was a woman of deep religious faith who had never entirely reconciled herself to her husband's theory, which seemed to her to undermine the foundations of the beliefs that she found most important. She had said so early in their marriage, and she had not said so again. She nursed him through his illnesses, managed the household with the efficiency that allowed him to work, read to him in the evenings, and loved him with a steadiness that he acknowledged in his autobiography as the great good fortune of his life. He was not a man who expressed emotion easily in public. In the document he wrote for his children, near the end of his life, he found the words, "The decade between the origin and the descent was, in the public narrative of Darwin's life, a period of consolidation, the working out of the implications of the 1859 theory, the accumulation of additional evidence, the gradual conquest of the scientific world by the Darwinian framework. In Darwin's private life, it was also a decade of grief. His daughter Annie had died in 1851, at the age of 10, of what was described as typhoid fever, or scarlet fever, or a combination of ailments that the medicine of the time could not reliably distinguish. Annie's death was, by Darwin's own account, the most painful event of his life, more painful than any illness, and more painful than any professional difficulty. She had been his favorite child. He wrote about her with a tenderness that he rarely allowed himself in any other context, and her death seems to have completed the erosion of whatever remained of his childhood Christianity. He could not believe, after Annie's death, in a God who allowed such things. The Descent of Man was, when it appeared in 1871, received with less shock and more weary recognition than the Origin had been. The implication of the Origin, that human beings were part of the natural world and had been shaped by the same processes as every other organism, had been visible since 1859, and 12 years of argument had somewhat dulled the edge of the novelty. What the Descent provided was the explicit statement of what the Origin had implied, and the evidence, from comparative anatomy, from embryology, from the behavior of animals, from the fossil record, that the statement was not merely speculative but had the support of the best available science. Darwin was aware, in writing The Descent, that he was handling material of great sensitivity. The question of human racial differences, which he addressed in the book with the frameworks of his time, frameworks that we now recognize as inadequate and sometimes pernicious, was a question that intersected with the most politically charged debates of the era. Darwin was not a racist in any simple sense. He was, by the standards of his time, a person of relatively humane views on the question of human equality, an opponent of slavery. He had witnessed slavery in Brazil during the Beagle voyage and found it profoundly disturbing, a believer in the essential unity of the human species. But he was also a man of his time and his class, and The Descent reflects this in ways that later generations have found troubling. He was, in the passage about sexual selection and human racial differences, applying a theoretical framework that was scientifically interesting and socially consequential, and the social consequences were not ones he fully thought through. The concept of sexual selection, the idea that the choice of mates shapes the evolution of characteristics that have no direct survival value but that are attractive to potential partners, was one of Darwin's most creative contributions to evolutionary theory, and it has proved more durable and more productive than many of his contemporaries recognized. The peacock's tail, the nightingale's song, the elaborate plumage of birds of paradise, these are the products of mate choice, not of survival pressure. Darwin proposed this in The Origin, developed it in The Descent, and was largely ignored by his contemporaries, who found the idea of female animals choosing their mates on aesthetic grounds implausible or slightly undignified. The rehabilitation of sexual selection as a major evolutionary mechanism came in the 20th century, through the work of population geneticists and behavioral ecologists who demonstrated, with mathematical and observational rigor, that Darwin had been right. The last decade of Darwin's life was, in some ways, the most peaceful. The great argument had been made and had been received and was being, with surprising speed, accepted. By the 1870s, the transmutation of species was no longer a controversial proposition among scientists, even if the specific mechanism of natural selection was still being debated and would continue to be debated for decades. He had won, not in the sense that every detail of his theory was confirmed, but in the sense that the framework he had provided, the framework of common descent, of the transformation of species through natural processes over vast spans of time, had become the organizing principle of biology. Other people were filling in the details. He had built the house. He turned, in these years, to the subjects that had always interested him most privately: the behavior of plants, the ecology of the garden, the small and intricate processes of the natural world that were visible without any apparatus more sophisticated than patient attention. He published Insectivorous Plants in 1875, a study of the Venus flytrap, the sundew, and other carnivorous plants, investigating the mechanisms by which they trapped and digested insects. He published The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization in the Vegetable Kingdom in 1876. He published The Different Forms of Flowers on Plants of the Same Species in 1877. He published The Power of Movement in Plants in 1880, co-authored with his son Francis, a study of the way plants respond to light and gravity and to the stimulus of touch. And then, in 1881, he published The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, with observations on their habits. The Worm Book, as it was known, was the last book Darwin completed. It was the culmination of an investigation he had begun in the 1830s, decades before the origin, when he had noticed on the property of his uncle Josiah Wedgwood that certain stones that had lain on the surface of a field had, over a period of years, sunk below the surface. He formed the hypothesis that earthworms, by their continuous burrowing and casting, were moving soil from below to above and thus burying objects that lay on the surface. He tested this hypothesis over 40 years, measuring the rate at which stones sank, examining the anatomy of earthworms, calculating the volume of soil they processed. The result was a book about earthworms that became, improbably, a bestseller. It became a bestseller because it was, in miniature, the same argument as The Origin, that vast and visible changes in the natural world could be produced by tiny, individual, incremental processes operating over very long spans of time. The earthworms did not intend to bury stones. Each individual worm simply moved a tiny quantity of soil without any awareness of the consequence, but accumulated over generations. The tiny movements of millions of individual worms produced a transformation of the landscape that was as significant in its way as any geological event. This was Darwin's vision of nature, not the vision of dramatic intervention and sudden change, but the vision of imperceptible, cumulative, patient process producing, across time, a world almost infinitely more complex and various and beautiful than any short view could reveal. He died at Downhouse on the 19th of April, 1882, at the age of 73. The immediate cause was heart failure. He had been suffering from angina and from a series of cardiac episodes in the weeks preceding his death. He died quietly in his bed with Emma beside him. His last words, by Emma's account, were addressed to her and to his children. "I am not the least afraid of death. Remember what good wives you have all been to me." He had asked to be buried in the churchyard at Down, next to his brother Erasmus and near the graves of several of his children. The scientific community had other plans. A campaign was organized, led by Huxley and others, to have him buried in Westminster Abbey, the signal honor of public burial in the nave of the National Church, among the other figures whom the nation had decided to remember as its own. The request was granted. Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 26th of April, 1882, in a ceremony attended by the scientific and political establishment of Victorian England. He lies near Isaac Newton. The proximity is a statement of relative worth so clear that it requires no elaboration, and it was intended as one. What he had done in the years between the Beagle's departure in 1831 and his death in 1882 was to provide a framework within which biology became a unified science rather than a collection of descriptions. Before Darwin, natural history was the accumulation of information about organisms, their structures, their habitats, their behaviors, the ways they could be classified. After Darwin, it was the investigation of a connected history, the story of life on Earth as a single, branching, evolving narrative, in which every organism alive today was connected to every other organism alive today by lines of descent that ran back, through the fossil record and the comparative evidence of anatomy and genetics, to the common ancestors of all life. The tree of life, Darwin's own image, sketched in his first transmutation notebook in 1837, with the single word "I think" above it, was the organizing metaphor of everything that followed. The theory of evolution by natural selection has been tested since 1859 by every method that science has developed, by the fossil record, by the comparative anatomy of living organisms, by the study of animal behavior, by genetics, by molecular biology, by the direct observation of evolution in laboratory populations, and in wild species responding to environmental change. In every test the framework has held. The details have been added to, and some of them have been revised. Darwin did not know about genes, did not understand the mechanism of heredity, could not have predicted the molecular biology that would, in the 20th century, demonstrate the shared genetic heritage of all living things at the level of the base pair. But the architecture he built has not fallen. It is still the architecture within which biology is conducted. He had walked his thinking path, the sandwalk, for 40 years, kicking flints at the corner to count his circuits, letting the movement and the familiar trees and the English light do their work on the problems he was carrying. He had grown his barnacles and his orchids and his earthworms, and he had watched his children grow and the garden change with the seasons, and he had spent his mornings writing and his afternoons walking and his evenings listening to Emma read. It was a quiet life for a man who had changed the way his species understood itself. It was exactly the life he had chosen. The Worm Book of 1881 was, in the long view, something more than a study of earthworms. It was Darwin's last statement of his deepest scientific conviction, that the world is remade continuously and invisibly by the accumulated actions of individual organisms pursuing their ordinary lives. The earthworms did not know they were burying fields. The bees did not know they were pollinating flowers. The pigeons did not know they were demonstrating the principles of inheritance to the man who was watching them in his garden down. But the aggregate of their unknowing actions, across generations and across landscapes, produced the natural world in all its complexity and beauty. This was, in its essentials, the same argument as the origin, the same argument about process and accumulation and time, applied now to the smallest and most humble of organisms. Darwin had always been attracted to the small and the humble. He had spent 8 years on barnacles, years on earthworms, years on the fertilization of orchids, years on the behavior of climbing plants, the large questions, the origin of species, the transformation of the living world, the place of human beings in nature, he addressed in the books that made him famous. But his daily work, the work he did in the garden at Down and in the correspondence with naturalists around the world and in the patient experiments that ran across decades, was the work of attention to the particular, to this earthworm, this orchid, this expression on this child's face. He had, by the time of the Worm Book, been celebrated beyond anything he had expected or entirely welcomed. He was the most famous scientist in England, probably the most famous scientist in the world, and the fame brought with it the obligations that he had always found difficult. The correspondence that required answers, the visitors who required receiving, the public invitations that required declining. He declined most invitations on grounds of health, which remained poor. He accepted the honorary degrees and the scientific medals with the mixture of genuine pleasure and embarrassment that characterized his response to all recognition. He cared about it and was grateful for it, and did not quite know what to do with it. His relationship with his children, as they grew and pursued their own careers, was a source of deep satisfaction. Several of them became scientists. George Darwin became an astronomer. Francis Darwin collaborated with his father on the plant physiology work and later became a botanist. Horace Darwin became an engineer who founded the Cambridge Scientific Instrument Company. Leonard Darwin became a soldier and a eugenicist, the last causing Darwin some discomfort, since the applications of evolutionary theory to human social policy were applications he had not endorsed and would have qualified heavily. His daughters helped with the correspondence, provided companionship, and maintained the household that made his work possible. He was not a man who talked about his theory in family settings. Emma's discomfort with its implications had established a domestic convention of restraint on the subject that persisted through their marriage, and Darwin honored it. His autobiography, written between 1876 and 1881, and not intended for publication in his lifetime, is the most candid account he left of his inner life. His loss of religious faith, his feelings about the death of Annie, his assessment of his own intellectual abilities, modest almost to the point of self-deprecation, and almost certainly wrong, his gratitude to Emma, his sense of the good fortune that had placed him at exactly the right moment in the position to ask the question that defined his century. The house at Down, when he died there in April 1882, had been his home for 40 years. The garden was his, shaped by his experiments and his preferences, thick with the specimens of plants he had studied and the paths he had walked. The sand walk was still there, its flints still at the corner. He had made, in the years of his life at Down, one of the most important contributions to human understanding in the history of human understanding, and he had made it quietly, in a country house in Kent, with an electrometer and a microscope and a walking path, and the patient habits of a man who believed, with absolute conviction, that the truth was there to be found if you looked carefully enough and for long enough.